To understand what the De Anima is about, it's going to be helpful to understand what the title means. So, De Anima is actually a Latin phrase. It's the Latin translation of the title of this work, which in Greek is perisukes, which means something like on the soul or of the soul, concerning the soul, about the soul, right? So sukes, right? Something like that. That's the Greek word for soul. Anima is the Latin word for soul. Why the title is in Latin, I have no idea. For whatever reason, this is just how it's traditionally done. This work is called the De Anima. They use a Latin title for it for no good reason. So this work, the De Anima, it's going to be about the soul. We know that much. And for those who are interested, psyches, that's actually where the word psychology comes from, or psyche, or whatever. Psyche there, or psych. That's from the Greek word for the soul. And so psychology literally means something like theory of the soul. And so what we're getting in the De Anima is a kind of, you know, psychological treatise, a treatise on psychology. And so what we can kind of expect, what Aristotle is doing, he's picking picking up the mantle from Plato. If you recall in Plato, um, there were occasional references to the soul. In the Gorgias, for instance, Socrates talks about how there are crafts concerned with the human good. And since the human being is kind of has these two aspects or part, body and soul, well, there are going to be crafts concerned with each of those and blah, 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 blah. Right. But he just assumes this division between body and soul, but doesn't really say much about the soul. And in the Republic, he talks about how education is a matter of turning the soul. Right. But again, he doesn't really talk much about the soul. In other places, Plato does, but we didn't read that, and so it goes. What we're going to see from Aristotle now, his particular ideas about the soul. Now, you might think, well, the soul, I don't know, that's an inherently religious thing. It's a kind of, spirit or something like that, inhabits a body and goes to heaven or hell and blah, 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 and so on, right? That's how we tend to think about the soul, right? This spiritual substance that's kind of immaterial. It's like who you are. It's where your conscience is, something like that. While Aristotle is going to agree with some of those kinds of things, he's going to think that your soul is kind of who you are. He's going to disagree with other parts of it. He doesn't think of it as this kind of spiritual substance, really. And it doesn't have religious connotations for Aristotle. And indeed, for the Greeks more generally, soul does not have any specifically religious connotations. What he's going to do in the De Anima, then, what Aristotle's going to do is he's going to try to determine what exactly this thing is. What exactly is the soul? And then, so some people today at least might want to say, well, look, I don't know. That's all fine and good for religious people. They think there's a soul, there's this spiritual substance or whatever that gets judged when you die and whatever else people think about it. But I'm not into all that, you might think, or you're right, this might be your impression. I don't believe all this gobbledygook about souls and so on. There's just whatever, right? That's not how it works. Well, what Aristotle would say and what the Greeks would say is that doesn't mean there's no soul. The soul, according to Aristotle, according to the Greeks, is simply the principle of life. It's what makes something alive. Whatever it is that makes something alive, that's the soul. And so at this point, when we're just talking about the soul, we're not making any particular claims about what it is. Maybe it's just matter. Maybe it's just your cells or whatever that make you alive, in which case that's what the quote unquote soul is, right? It need not be some mystical spiritual substance or something like that. It's just whatever it is that makes things alive. That's the soul. If something's alive, it has a soul. That's how Aristotle and the Greeks use the word, right? And so this isn't going to be a religious treatise, although he's going to talk about God at some point. We'll see at the very end. The soul, it's really a treatise on life, what makes things alive, how life works. That's really what they're getting at. That's what Aristotle's getting at when he's talking about the soul. What is the nature of life? What does life come from? What makes something alive? Right? That's what the Anima is concerned with. Now, one implication of this view is that anything that's alive has a soul. And Aristotle and Plato and the rest of the Greeks would say, yeah, exactly. Anything that's alive has a soul. This is very different from how we tend to use the word soul, right? We tend to think only human beings have souls. That's not at all how Aristotle thinks about it. That's not at all how Plato thought about it. Dogs have souls, cows and chickens and horses and every other kind of animal. Ants have souls, bees have souls, plants have souls, right? Trees, ferns, whatever you like, cactuses, cacti. Bacteria have souls. Why? Because all those things are alive. Anything that's alive has something that makes it alive. Whatever that something is, that's its soul. Right? That's where Plato, Aristotle, and the Greeks in general are starting from, right? And so when he's talking about the soul, he's really talking about life. The soul is the principle of life. It's what makes something alive. Okay, so the first question that Aristotle wants to answer or address is, well, what exactly is the soul? It's it's whatever, it's whatever it is what makes you alive. Well, what is it that makes you alive? What is the soul? What exactly is it? We know something about it, namely it makes you alive. That's kind of true by definition according to Aristotle. But what exactly is this thing that makes things alive? For Aristotle, drawing on the physics, there are going to only be only three candidates here, right? Because when we're analyzing plants and frogs and human beings and so on, there are really only kind of three things there, right? A frog is a hylomorphic compound. And what that means is that it's composed of matter and form. And so, really, there are only three candidates for what the soul could possibly be. It's either just the thing itself, the frog itself, the composite of matter and form, or it's one of those two things, the matter or the form. Now, let's think of this again in the human case. Let me remind you of what exactly the matter and form and the composite of matter and form are. The matter of a human being is going to be the organs and stuff that it's made up out of, right? The liver and brain and heart and lungs and bones and eyeballs and blood and flesh and all that kind of stuff. Right? Not to be too gory about it, but that's the matter of a human being. Now, one of the things you might hopefully think looking at that pile of human tissue is that, well, that's not alive, and that's not really a human being. That's exactly what Aristotle would think. That's a very Aristotelian thought, because that stuff isn't really structured or arranged. And now we're getting at the nature of form. The form of a human being is going to be the kind of shape that all this stuff takes. It's like the form of a human being is like the blueprint of a human being, right? That's how Aristotle's thinking about it. In the same way that you have a kind of blueprint of a house, which, this is where the pipes go. These are where the walls are. This is where we, whatever, put the electrical wires and so on, right? That's all part of the blueprint, say, of a house, the kind of plan outline of the house. Well, there's a similar kind of thing going on with natural organisms, in this case, a human being. There's a kind of structure or arrangement. And this structure or arrangement's not going to refer merely to the external structure, which is what I kind of have pictured there, but also the internal structure, right? These are where those bones go. This is where the lungs are and the intestines and so on, right? This is where all that stuff goes. So also the kind of internal structure, in the same way that the blueprint of a house will tell you where the internal walls are, and so on. Okay. That's the form of a human being. And we're going to talk, that's a kind of first pass at what the form of a human being is. We're going to talk about it in more detail as we proceed. Having the matter over on one side and the form in some way or other over on the other side, right? You don't have a human being yet. Rather, what needs to happen is that form needs to come and arrange that matter. And then you get a composite of matter and form. You get a human being, right? So those are the three candidates. So let's bring them all back on the stage now. Which one of those is going to be the soul? Well, the key idea in Aristotle's argument here, and this is in II.1 of the De Anima, is that life, which is, that's kind of the soul. Soul is what gives life. Life is something that is attributed to something else. Things can be alive. Life is a property. That's really what he's getting at. Life is a property of things. It's attributed to things. It's a kind of predicate. Something is alive, right? When we say that something is alive, we're using life as a predicate. We're attributing life to that something. And this is going to be key to determining what the soul is, according to Aristotle. Because what he is going to say is that, well, let's consider the composite of matter and form. The composite of matter and form is not attributed to something else. Rather, things are attributed to it. The human being is alive, right? The composite of matter and form is alive. The composite of matter and form is a subject. It's not a predicate. The composite of matter and form is something to which things are attributed. It is not itself an attribute of other things. That's a sign then that the composite of matter and form is not itself the soul. Rather, what Aristotle would say is that it has a soul. The composite is not itself a soul, but rather has a soul. And so the composite of matter and form is not going to be the soul, right? Because the composite is a subject, things are attributed to it, and the subject is not itself attributed to other things. The subject, you are not yourself a property of something else. But by the very same token, Aristotle is going to argue, the matter can't be the soul either. The matter is also a subject. Things are attributed or predicated of the matter. And so what Aristotle is saying here is actually fairly controversial, if you will, or it's staking out a definite position which people have disagreed with. It's not uncommon today to hear people say things like, well, human beings, they're just a bunch of flesh and bones. It's just a bunch of guts and organs and whatever, or whatever. I don't know what people say exactly. But to think of the human being as simply the material out of which they're made, that's all there is to a human being. It's just all the organs and tissues and things. That's all a human being is. Just a assortment of organs and tissues. And what Aristotle is saying is, no, that's not true. An assortment of organs and tissues, that's just the matter of a human being. That's just a pile of human parts. You're telling me that thing is a human being? That's absurd. That's crazy. And a pile of human parts is not yet a human being. It needs to be arranged in a particular way, right? And well, look, if we've eliminated two of the candidates, That means the remaining candidate has to be the soul. And that's exactly what Aristotle thinks. The form of a human being is the human soul. It is the form that makes a thing alive. It is the particular arrangement of organs that makes a human being alive, right? Just having a pile of organs, you don't have an alive human being at that point. If those organs are arranged in a highly particular organized way, well, yeah, then you do have a living, breathing human being. That's Aristotle's idea. And so the soul of a human being, the principle of life of a human being, what makes a human being alive is the human form. And the same thing can be said with the appropriate substitutions for any living thing. So yes, plants have souls, according to Aristotle. The soul of a plant is its form, or it's the particular arrangement of its parts. And we'll talk again, like I said, about the form in more detail as we proceed. But this leads Aristotle, this kind of argument that he gives, these arguments, leads Aristotle to define the soul as following. And this definition of soul that he gives is very famous. It's what everyone cites when they talk about Aristotle and soul. But at first glance, it's very confusing. It's unclear what he's saying. So Aristotle's very famous, but somewhat confusing, at least at first glance, definition of the soul is that the soul is the first grade of actuality of a natural body having life potentially within it. Now, there's all kinds of things built into this, and we're not going to look at all of them. And in particular, what we're not going to look at is all this stuff about a natural body having life potentially within it. When you start trying to unpack what exactly that entails and means, you get into all kinds of complications related to Aristotle's view of the soul, and we're just not doing that. That part of the definition, however, you might think, like, I don't know. I mean, that's easy enough. Really, all he's talking about is like of a body, right? It's the first grade of actuality of like a body, of like organs, of like flesh and bones and stuff. That's not so bad. The worst part is that first part, the first grade of actuality. What on earth is that? The idea is not that complicated. So first, to just kind of whatever. When we were looking at Aristotle's hylomorphism, one of the things that we saw is that Aristotle associates form with actuality. And so when he's talking about the first grade of actuality, that should, ring a bell. Actuality, that's got to be form. And that's exactly what he's kind of referring to here is the form of a human being. But what does this first grade stuff mean? First grade of actuality. To explain this, Aristotle uses an example of mathematics. And I'm going to do the same. So he talks about 3 different states that you might be in with regard to knowledge, or he might just use knowledge. He might not use mathematics in particular. I'm going to use knowledge of calculus, of that branch of mathematics, to illustrate Aristotle's point. There might be there are 3 possible states that a human being could be in with regard to knowing calculus: potential, first grade of actuality, and second grade of actuality. Potential knowledge of calculus. What is that? That is someone. Okay, that's in the wrong spot. Derivatives, integrals, what? That's supposed to be, they're thinking about that. It's supposed to be above their head. I don't know why it's not there. PowerPoints can't be perfect. You're in the potential. You have potential knowledge of calculus when you don't know calculus, right? When you have no idea what derivatives or integrals are, you would have no idea how to do any of that. You have potential knowledge of calculus. Human beings could potentially learn it, but initially, at least, they don't know it at all. At that point, you're in the potential state. But now let's say you take math 2.0. I don't even know what calculus is here at Loyola, whatever. You take the calculus class, you take calculus 1, take calculus 2, whatever, and you acquire calculus, knowledge of calculus. And then let's say you're doing your calculus homework, right? You're doing a calculus problem. You know calculus and you're doing a calculus problem. That's the second grade of actuality. That guy there has taken his calculus classes. He's doing his calculus homework. He's activating his knowledge of calculus. He's got a calculus badge on because he knows calculus, right? That's the second grade of actuality. And the first grade of actuality would be that person who knows calculus. They have their calculus badge, but they're not actually doing calculus, right? The first grade of actuality would be somebody who knows calculus, but is doing something else, is sleeping, is zoning out, is playing cards, is recording a lecture on the day Anima, whatever, doing anything else. That person then has the first grade of actuality. They know calculus, they're not using it though, right? And so the first grade of actuality is different from potential, because when you're at the potential stage, you don't actually know calculus. Whereas when you're at the first grade of actuality, you do know calculus. You're just not using it. And then when you're at the second grade of actuality, you know calculus and you've kind of activated your knowledge. You're using your knowledge of it, right? That's the distinction that Aristotle draws. And so what he's saying is that the first grade, what he's saying is that the soul is like the first grade of actuality of a natural body having life potentially within it. The soul is like that first grade. So what does that mean? His idea is, well, look, it's like one way to kind of understand the difference would be to contrast it with the second grade and potential. Potential, and this gets tricky. We're not going to worry about it so much, but potential for our purposes is going to be sufficient. Potential would be like that pile of organs. Strictly speaking, it's not. A pile of organs is not potentially alive, according to Aristotle. This is where it gets very tricky, and we're just not going to worry about it. But for our purposes, you can think of like potentially alive as being that pile of organs. It's not actually alive yet. And then the second grade of actuality would be something like engaging in life activities, doing things, being active about life. And we're going to see what exactly that amounts to in a later video. Aristotle is going to go on and detail the different kinds of life activities that organisms engage in. Just very quickly, one of them is nutrition, right? So eating food is a kind of life activity. When you are eating food, you would be at the second grade of actuality, but you're not always eating food. Sometimes you're not doing anything, right? You're just sleeping or zoning out or whatever, right? You're just not doing anything. You're not active about life. You're not engaging in any particular life activity. That's the first grade of actuality. That's what the soul is. Soul is like your knowledge of calculus. You can put it to use, but you don't know, you're not always putting it to use, right? That's what the soul is. You can put the soul to use, but you're not always doing that. You can be active about life even though you're not always. You're still alive, you still have a soul. And so really what this definition amounts to is simply that the soul is the form of the body, right? Which is what we just saw. The first grade of actuality really just refers to the form. Natural body having life potentially within it really just refers to the body or all the parts of the body parts, the organs, and so on. That's all Aristotle really means. This complicated definition of the soul really just means that the soul is the form of the body. Now, what exactly these life activities are, what exactly the different kinds of soul are, what kinds of soul the human being in particular has, what exactly more particularly a soul is, we're going to address those questions as we proceed.